Introducing the remarkable archetype, the dangerous gentleman. With a demeanor that commands respect and a hint of potency, he embodies strength tempered by virtue. Though his capabilities could veer towards danger, he channels his power for noble causes, serving others and safeguarding those in need. Rooted in a profound love for both God and humanity, he navigates life with discipline and purpose. In his presence, one witnesses the harmonious blend of power and benevolence, a testament to the true essence of masculinity. Step into the world of the dangerous gentleman, where strength is wielded for righteousness, and discover a captivating embodiment of honor and valor. Welcome to the Dangerous Gentleman podcast. Yes, I am the Dangerous Gentleman. No, I did not give myself that nickname, but I certainly did earn it. Now, I tell a lot of stories on my podcast, and you may be wondering why. It's not because I think that my stories are better than anyone else's. I'm not here to say that my story is any worse than anyone else's either. All I'm trying to do is tell my story. And that brings me to the topic that I want to talk about today is the importance of story and how important it is that we know our story, that we understand how we got to where we are and how we go from here. Like I've mentioned to several times that I thought my story was kind of boring growing up, and that I kind of put it out there that I wanted a more interesting story, a more interesting testimony, and then my life went kind of nuts. And so when I first started this podcast, I assumed that I would be telling a lot of stories that happened after my life went sideways, because that was the interesting part. But if I actually go back and look, if I actually go back and see which stories I've recorded, a significant number of them actually happened before my life went sideways, before it took that quote unquote interesting turn. And I realized I was just thinking about this actually over the weekend, and that's why I ended up recording this episode, is because I was looking back and I'm like, wow, those stories got me to where I am. That my stories got me to where I was before my life got interesting. And then my life got more interesting. And yes, my stories may be more interesting, but they're not any more or any less mine, right? I used to compare my testimony to the people of like drug dealers, people whose lives had been spared, people whose situations had been so twisted and so gone sideways, and that now their life was redeemed, and that's what made them interesting. And I thought that my kind of milquetoast, good old American upbringing was somehow boring. It was somehow my story was worse than other people's. Or in some ways that my story was better because I was raised a certain way, and that I was, like that my story was somehow superior. But the truth is that there's nothing more or less interesting or compelling about my story than really anybody else's. And my story isn't better. My story isn't worse, but it is mine. It is my story. And you need to own your story. Whatever that story is, whatever circumstances, whatever situations happened to you growing up, whatever decisions, whatever actions you took over the course of your life, own those. So yeah, own that story. Your story doesn't make you better than someone. Your story doesn't make you worse than someone. Your story is the one thing that you have in this world that no one else does. No one else, regardless of how similar their life may have been, regardless of if they're the same demographic as you, their story is going to be different. Even if you were both raised as preacher's kids, your story is going to be different. Even if you both grew up on the streets of Chicago, your story is going to be different. Regardless of how similar anybody's story is, it's going to be different. There's going to be big differences. I have a twin brother. So literally from before birth, we experienced the exact same things. And then when we were born, we were both raised in exactly the same house, by the same parents, went to the same schools, had basically the same social circles up to about the age of 26, 27, when I went away to school and my brother joined the military. Up until that time, we had pretty much had the same people in our lives, very little differences. And since then, our lives have gone very different, but we still have that shared experience, but we both turned out different. Yeah, we're very similar. Someday I'll talk about the whole twin thing because it's kind of fun, but we are also very different people. We respond in a lot of the same ways, but sometimes we're so different. So I think it's important for each of us to understand and recognize, and here's the big word, appreciate our story. And we need to learn to be able to tell it. I really started to learn how to tell my story when I started to go to Narcotics Anonymous, and I would be sharing, right? And I started to notice a theme. I started to notice certain things that came up in my life over and over again, whether they were from my own actions or my own thoughts or decisions. I started to notice these things that seemed to happen to me over and over again. And I realized that for most of my life, I wasn't learning the lessons that could come from those things. And then I started to look back at them and realize those were all lessons. Those were all things that guided me to becoming who I am now. And without those things, I wouldn't be who I am. And yeah, there are some of them that I wish had never happened. There are plenty of them that I wish would have gone a different way, but I can't change that. My story got me to where I am now, but it doesn't determine where I go from here. I determine where I go from here. God determines where I go from here, right? So all that stuff that happened, yeah, it's important. And it's important to remember it because they say about history that those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it. So I repeated a lot of things. I repeated a lot of bad things. And as I would sit in those NA meetings, those Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and I would start to tell my story, and I got really pretty good at telling my story because oftentimes it was the same theme. And now here I am. I'm 15 years into my chiropractic practice, and I tell stories to my patients all the time, and I hear their stories. Right. It's just as much me telling them about my life and the things that I've experienced and how I've been through similar things as them, as it is them coming in and telling me what's going on with their life, because I can relate. I can relate to them and they can relate to me. And when we can relate to each other, we get along better. They're more receptive to my treatment. They're more receptive to the things I have to say because we can relate. And I've learned over the course of my life and my career that if I look very hard, if I look very deep at all, I can relate to just about anybody. I can find similarities in their story and mine. There's very few people that I can't do that with. And it's important for all of us. You may think that you're alone, and that's one of the tactics of society and culture is to try to convince us that we're alone, that no one else is on our side because their story is different than ours. Well, if we look very deep, if we look very hard, we can find areas where we can relate. We can find common ground. There's very few people out there that I can't find some kind of piece of some kind of common ground between us, whether it's a drug addict, whether it's a religious person, whether it's a medical professional, or someone who's worked retail, or someone who's been at the very bottom, right? The very bottom of that hole. Or even someone who goes to the gym, right? I can relate to these people. I can find something to relate to. And that's the power of story, the power of knowing your story, and the power of asking people about their story is you find common ground. And we may disagree on a whole bunch of stuff, but if we have common ground somewhere in our stories, the world gets a lot better. The world gets both smaller. The whole saying, it's a small world when you run into somebody who's got a similar story or grew up where you did or whatever, but it also makes the world a lot bigger because we can realize that we can relate to people. We can relate to almost anybody if we allow any differences to be set aside. So the world gets smaller, And the world gets bigger when we tell our story. And I think it's important too. One thing that I've learned over the years is to kind of rehearse your story. The big points, like the ones that you tell all the time. Several of the stories that I've told, the two suitcases and a backpack, right? Why do you think I said that? Because I've said that very thing multiple times. I've gotten it down where I understand, oh, I know what two suitcases, I know how to tell that story because I say two suitcases and a backpack, and then boom, my brain plugs in. So I think it's important to learn how to tell your story because the better you can tell it, and I'm not saying make up facts, I'm not saying to lie, I'm saying learn how to tell your story in a compelling way so that people can listen to you, so that you can catch their attention, so that you can find that common ground. That's where I learned. I learned in NA how to tell that story because I listened to other people tell their story and I told my story enough to find out the things that people can relate to. Stories about how I grew up, stories about the church that I was in, the experiences that I've been through. I've learned how to tell those stories. My daughter's birth, each of my son's birth, all the craziness that happened, right? It's important to have your story. And don't ever compare your story to anyone else's because your story is no better. Your story is no worse than anybody else's, but it is yours and own it, right? You can't change it. You can't change what's happened up until now, but you can redirect where you go from here. It helps you to figure out who you are. It helps you figure out where you go from here, to know where you came from. So own it. That story is yours. That story is yours. And that story is powerful. And it's powerful to you. And don't think that it might not help someone else. Don't be so ashamed of it that you'll never tell it to anybody. Because you never know. You never know how telling your story might affect somebody else. I've just been chatting with people and I started to tell something from my past and all of a sudden I'll see their eyes go wide or I'll see tears start to form in the corner of their eye. And I had no idea how powerful that was because it was just part of my story, but it was powerful to that person. And that person then shares with me how it impacted them. Just last night, I was talking to a friend of mine. I've known him for 30 years. He's going through a hard time. And he starts to tell me all this craziness that's happening in his life. And all these just, it was just one thing after another. I paused. I told him, hold on a second. And I told him about a very similar circumstance in my life where I had a whole bunch of stuff that just started to weigh down on me. And it all piled up, one thing after another, after another, after another. And he's like, oh, wow. So how did you deal with that? I had no idea that I was going to have that conversation. And I had no idea that he was going to tell me the things that he told me. And I had no idea what the impact of me telling him the things that I had gone through, how it would impact him. But it did in a very real and powerful way. And we ended up, what was originally going to be a 5 or 10 minute conversation, we ended up talking for over an hour. And I was able to relate to him because I found the similarities. I found the common ground in our story. And it was a very powerful piece of common ground. We had both been at the bottom. Well, I had been at the bottom and I have been climbing my way out for several years. And he right now is currently at the bottom. Right. It seems like his life can't get any worse. But I told him, listen, brother, there's a way out. And if I can find that way out, you can find that way out. Because I'm no more special than you. I'm no different than you. I am a fallen human being. I have my flaws. There's nothing special about me that got me out other than the fact that I kept going. And I was able to share with him some of the wisdom that I've learned along the way that maybe it'll save him some hardship. Maybe it'll save him some of that difficulty. But it was because we were able, and I've known this guy for 30 years, and he didn't know these things about me. Even though I had known him all that time, I told him this part of my story that he had never heard before. He's like, I didn't know that about you. I was like, yeah, man. He's like, there was this sense of, I'm not alone. And so that's a big piece of why you should know and why you should own your story is so that you can find common ground, so that you can make the world a little smaller for people and a little bigger. Don't compare your story. It's yours, and it got you to where you are, but it doesn't determine where you go from here. So if you like this content, please give it a rating, a review, and share it with your friends. Also, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about me and what I'm all about and what I can maybe do for you, check out my website at thedangerousgentleman.org. That's thedangerousgentleman.org. Thank you for listening.